I used to believe that the safest part of my day was the quiet walk from my car to my apartment late at night because the neighborhood was calm, predictable, and familiar in a way that made even darkness feel routine rather than threatening, and I never imagined that this ordinary stretch of sidewalk would become the setting for a confrontation built entirely on a rule that did not exist outside someone else's imagination. The apartment complex where I lived sat on the edge of a residential block, filled with identical buildings, evenly spaced streetlights, trimmed hedges, and narrow sidewalks that felt almost ceremonial in their order. And most of the residents were working adults whose schedules didn't align neatly, which meant cars came and went at all hours without anyone feeling the need to question it. Despite that unspoken understanding, there was one woman who seemed to treat the neighborhood not as a shared space, but as a system that required constant supervision, because she was always visible, whether standing on her balcony, lingering near her doorway, or slowly pacing the parking lot as if she were performing an inspection rather than taking a walk. I noticed her early on, not because she spoke to me immediately, but because her attention lingered in a way that felt deliberate, as though she were cataloging movements and routines rather than casually observing them, and whenever our paths crossed, her gaze carried the weight of judgment rather than curiosity. Our first actual interaction occurred weeks before everything escalated. On an evening when I returned home late from work, and she made a pointed comment about how some people didn't respect reason, able hours, delivering the remark with a tight smile that suggested she expected agreement rather than explanation. I brushed it off at the time, because engaging with unsolicited authority rarely leads to understanding, and I assumed she would eventually redirect her attention elsewhere. Once she realized I wasn't interested in playing a role in whatever system of control she imagined herself enforcing, that assumption collapsed on a quiet weekday night when I arrived home just after 11, carrying a bag of takeout and mentally replaying the day's conversations, completely unaware that my presence alone was about to be reframed as a violation. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool air settling around me and the streetlights stretching my shadow across the pavement, her voice cut through the silence with an edge sharp enough to feel intentional, announcing that I was not supposed to be out at that hour. I turned slowly, confused more than alarmed, and saw her standing near the entrance of her building with her arms crossed and her posture rigid, her expression carrying a mix of irritation and confidence that suggested she believed she was correcting an obvious mistake rather than initiating a confrontation. When I asked what she meant, she stated plainly that I was breaking curfew, saying the word as if it were universally understood, as though the neighborhood itself had collectively agreed on a rule that I had chosen to ignore. The idea struck me as strange enough that I glanced around instinctively, half expecting to see a posted notice or sign I had somehow missed. But the surroundings remained unchanged, silent and indifferent to the claim being made in their midst. I explained calmly that I lived there, that I had just returned from work, and that I was unaware of any curfew, citywide or otherwise, hoping that clarity would dissolve what seemed like a misunderstanding. She responded by shaking her head slowly, her lips pressed together in disapproval, and insisted that safety regulations existed whether I acknowledged them or not, framing her belief as common knowledge rather than personal invention. Recognizing that the conversation was rooted more in certainty than fact, I ended the exchange with a polite good night and continued toward my building, aware of her gaze following me with the intensity of someone who felt defied. I told myself the moment would fade, that people sometimes assert strange things and then move on, and that there was no reason to give it more weight than it deserved. The next night proved how wrong that assumption was. As I parked my car and opened the door, I noticed her standing near the edge of the lot, phone already in hand, watching with a focus that suggested preparation rather than coincidence. Before I had even stepped fully onto the sidewalk, she raised her voice and announced that she had warned me, projecting her words across the open space as if an audience were required. I stopped, feeling irritation rise, and asked what she was talking about, only to have her lift her phone higher and declare that she had already reported me, stating it with the satisfaction of someone who believed action equaled authority. She turned slightly away, pacing as she spoke into the device, narrating my arrival as a repeated offense, describing me as someone who ignored rules and wandered the neighborhood late at night, as though intent mattered less than timing. Standing there with my dinner cooling in my hands, I experienced the unsettling realization that normal behavior can sound suspicious when framed with enough confidence, and that being reported carries weight regardless of the truth. When the police car arrived, its headlights sweeping across the pavement before settling into stillness, The situation crossed from surreal to unmistakably real. The officers stepped out, their expressions neutral and professional, clearly expecting a situation grounded in something more substantial than what they were about to encounter. She rushed toward them immediately, launching into a detailed explanation about repeated curfew violations, ignored warnings, and personal discomfort, using language that suggested persistence where there had been none. The officers listened patiently, allowing her to finish before turning their attention to me. And when asked for my side of the story, I explained everything from my work schedule to my residence, emphasizing the complete absence of any curfew. The moment that shifted the entire interaction came when one officer asked her to specify which curfew she was referring to, a simple request that required definition rather than assumption. Her hesitation was brief but telling, followed by a vague reference to neighborhood rules and city safety measures that existed more as ideas than enforceable policies. The officers exchanged a glance before explaining calmly that no such curfew existed for adults, and that the city had enacted no restrictions limiting residents from returning home at night. Frustration replaced certainty on her face as she argued that rules should exist, that safety required them, and that people should not be allowed to move freely simply because the law permitted it. The second officer clarified that personal discomfort does not create legal authority, and that calling the police is reserved for actual violations rather than imagined ones. When she demanded to know whether they intended to let this continue, the response was immediate and measured, stating plainly that nothing illegal had occurred. They apologized to me for the interruption, advised that continued harassment could be addressed through proper channels, and returned to their vehicle, leaving the parking lot as quietly as they had entered it. She remained standing for a moment, rigid and silent, before turning abruptly and retreating into her building, the performance of authority dissolving without the validation she had expected. I went inside my apartment that night carrying more than my dinner, replaying the interaction and recognizing how fragile the line between normalcy and accusation can be when someone decides to invent rules. In the days that followed, I continued my routine unchanged, coming home late when necessary, refusing to alter my life to accommodate imaginary boundaries imposed by someone else's discomfort. She avoided me entirely after that, never speaking again, never meeting my eyes, as if silence could rewrite the outcome. There was never a curfew, but the lesson remained, clear and unsettling, that some people do not seek rules for safety or order, but for control, and the quiet refusal to comply with imagined authority can be the most effective response of all.